As we hear in our gospel today, Jesus frequently uses stories in order to get his point across to the people to whom he is speaking. In today's gospel, he uses that parable of the landowner and the tenants that work his land. And these stories, or these parables, are good because they're less forceful than just telling someone, right, you're wrong because you're doing this. Right? Usually he sort of draws the listeners in, and as he does today, right, he questions them. How would you judge this situation? And usually they end up judging themselves. Right? These wretched men will go to a wretched death. So they're saying, right, we're doing wrong, and we should be held accountable. Another great thing about these stories, these parables, is that they have many different layers. You could draw many different meanings from them. One of the lessons that we can draw from today's parable is that we have to cooperate with God. Right? We have to work alongside Him. So I want to look at three things in this area. First of all, the primacy of God's grace in our lives, the necessity for our cooperation, our free will, and then how to form our will to do what we ought to do. So first of all, what place does God's grace have in our lives as Christians? Right? Grace is that supernatural gift from God that He bestows on us through the merits of Christ. And it's aimed at our salvation. And that is the point of God giving us this gift of grace. God gives us what we need in order to attain our final goal and our ultimate happiness. And there are two types of grace. The first one comes into us through our baptism. Right? It's called sanctifying grace. It sanctifies us. Right? We say that baptism is necessary for salvation. So it's that gift that God gives us to be able to achieve salvation. And we keep this type of grace as long as we are out of mortal sin. Right? We lose sanctifying grace by offending God gravely. And it's restored whenever mortal sin is removed through sacramental confession. The second type of grace is called actual grace. Right? Not actual because the other one is not real, but actual in the sense that it's giving at those moments when we need it most. Right? In those moments whenever we're tested, whenever we have to choose to either do good or avoid evil, and it's a difficult choice, God gives us actual grace to help us in that moment to do the good or to avoid the evil. And so back to that original question, right? What place does God's grace have in our lives? What has a place of primacy? Right? Our whole goal is to get to heaven, and we can't do that without the help of God. And so God gives us His grace to be able to help us on the way to heaven. And so relating this to the story, God's grace is seen in the generosity in the work of the landowner, right? Before he hands over his land to the tenants. Right? The guy owns the land, so he's put himself out by acquiring the land. He's planted the vineyard. He's put a hedge around it for protection. He's dug the wine press so when that the fruit comes, they can do something with it. He's built a tower to be able to look over the vineyard. He's done all of this work to prepare the vineyard to produce fruit before he even hands it over to the tenants to work it. And so that's like God's grace, right? He prepares so much and hands it over to us. St. Augustine said in one of his sermons that God created us without us, but He did not will to save us without us. Right? God can't force salvation on us. We have to willingly accept it. And so this is why we hear that the landowner turned the vineyard over to the tenants. Right? He did as much as he could. He prepared the vineyard to produce that good fruit, and then he handed it over to the tenants so that they could work it. Right? He wanted to allow them to participate in the action of producing the fruit. He wanted them to be able to share in the joy of seeing those plants, those vines come to fruition. He did all that he could to prepare the land and then handed it over at the last stage for the workers to help along. And it probably would have been easier for the landowner simply to do it himself. Right? He knew the land well. It was his land. He had planted the vineyard. He had done all this work. It probably would have been easier for him just to do it all on his own. But God wants us to be a part of the work. He wants us to be part of our own salvation. Right? We have to be willing to accept the help that he gives. God will not force his love on us. Right? We have to accept it willingly. And so just as the tenants chose freely to go into the vineyard and to work, and just as they chose freely later on to reject the landowner, right, who had given him so much, we too have to make a choice. We can either accept God's grace, we can either cooperate with the help that he wants to give us, or we can reject it. We cannot allow it to affect our lives. The fact that the workers rejected the landowner's messengers didn't change the fact that the landowner was good. Right? That the landowner had done all of these wonderful things for them to prepare the vineyard. Right? His work was still done, and the vineyard was still at their disposal. But they didn't receive anything of what the vineyard produced. Right? They were kicked out of the vineyard because they refused to cooperate with the landowner. And it's the same with us. Right? God is always willing to give us what we need. Right? His work is always done. God's grace is always available to us to make use of along the way to salvation. But there comes a time when we have to make a decision. Right? Are we going to accept God's grace? Are we going to accept God's help? Or are we going to reject it? Are we going to go our own way? So how do we go about receiving God's grace, being open to cooperating with him? How do we open ourselves up to the help that God holds out to us for our taking so that he can help us on the way to salvation? I want to give two practical things that we can do. The first one is to simply stay in a state of grace. Right? After our baptism, we're in that state of grace. But if we fall to mortal sin, we are out of that state of grace. Right? The Catechism says very clearly that unrepentant mortal sin keeps people out of heaven. And so if we fall into mortal sin, we should get to confession as quickly as we can, to be restored to that state of grace so that we can be in connection with God. The second way that we can open ourselves up to God's grace, to cooperating with him, is to say yes in little ways. Right? Opening ourselves up in very small ways. We can't expect to be able to say yes in big ways if we don't first start small ways. Right? We have to develop a habit of cooperating with God's grace, a habit of opening ourselves up to the help that he wants to give us. So for example, if we want to start fasting, probably not a good idea for us to say that we're going to start by not eating anything 3 days a week. Right? We'll get maybe like 3 or 4 hours into that first day. Something's going to happen. We're going to eat, and then we're going to give up. Right? So we have to start small. Maybe we leave a bite or two of food on our plate one day. Maybe we give up a dessert one day a week. Right? Something small, but something that we can do. Because every time we say yes, right, we train ourselves to be able to cooperate with the grace that God is trying to give us. So this parable, the story of the landowner and his ungrateful tenants, helps us to understand that connection between God's grace, right, God holding out his help to us, and our free will, right, our need to say yes to him, to allow him into our lives. Right, God's grace is primary. God's grace acts first. But we also have a part to play, right? We have to open ourselves up to be able to receive that grace that he wants to give us. He's always there. He's to help us, always willing to give us what we need. The question is, are we willing to accept it? Or do we find ourselves like those ungrateful tenants who refuse his help, right? Who reject him? He wants to help us along the way to salvation. We just have to learn how to let him one small yes at a time.